Hello, I'm Alan Fogading. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Institute of Food Technologists Scientific Journals. Welcome to this webinar on how to publish in IFT scientific journals. As you can see, we have two associate editors, Julie Goddard and Mary Ellen Camerity, who will share their wisdom on how to assure that the manuscript you submitted to our journals becomes a published paper. First, we'll start with some information about the Institute of Food Technologists journals. The Journal of Food Science is our main scientific journal. It's divided into 8 topical sections that you see here. Also listed are the scientific editors for each section. I would advise you to take a look at this because when you submit your manuscript to the Journal of Food Science, you're going to be asked to pick one of these sections. Also, you see with the scientific editors, there's a resource if you have any questions concerning the content or the appropriateness of your manuscript for that section. The Journal of Food Science is the main scientific journal for the Institute of Food Technologists. It's been published since 1936, and it was initially titled Food Research. There are 12 monthly online issues a year, and quarterly we have a printed version. One of the things to note is that we receive about 2,000 submissions a year. Of those submissions, only 350 make it through to be published. The key elements that are responsible for assuring that your submission is one of the 350 that is published each year is to make sure you follow the guidelines that are going to be discussed later on in this webinar. And also please note that we receive submissions from 75 countries and published papers from over 42 countries last year. So we have a very broad base of not only people who are submitting to our journal, but also people who are reading our journal. Our journal that covers reviews is Comprehensive Reviews in Food Science and Food Safety. This is published online, and we started it in 2002. One of the big advantages of this journal is that it's free access. That means that if you have a computer and you can get to the website, you can download and read the article. We receive about 200 submissions a year, and of that, about 60 are published. It has a very high impact factor at 5.97 and is ranked 3 out of 128 journals in the food science area. One of the key elements of this journal is to assure that your manuscript is, as it says in the title, comprehensive. With that, we require at least 10,000 words in the body text and references. If it's less than 10,000 words, then it will be considered for a concise review in the Journal of Food Science. Our last journal is a Journal of Food Science Education. This has a very different audience and a very different goal. Here, our goal is to facilitate educators in the food science area. It's been published since 2002 and is again an online-only journal and is freely accessible to anyone who can get to the website. One of the key indicators of this type of journal and these types of publications is how much they are used. With that, we like to look at the articles that are downloaded. You will see that in 2017, we had 62,000 articles downloaded. We would like to think that that represents at least 62,000 times an educator looked to the Journal of Food Science Education to help in their teaching. With that, I come to the end of my presentation. You're going to hear now from our other two speakers, and I encourage you to pay attention to the very valuable information they're going to present. So now I'm going to turn it over to Julie.
Thank you very much, Alan. To continue our discussion, I'm going to first outline what are some of the key elements of a good paper. We start with good science, presented as a good story with excellent clarity, grammar, and readability, and make sure that we're following all editorial logistics. It sounds really easy, doesn't it? Well, not always. Unfortunately, it can happen that wonderful science can be horribly presented and end up in a rejection pile. Similarly, no matter how much you dress up bad science with good writing, it can never change the fundamental quality of the science. And please don't forget the importance of following editorial logistics, things like format requirements, including meaningful graphical abstracts if required, suggesting appropriate reviewers with whom you have no conflict. I often tell my students to remember that for most of us with any kind of editorial role, this is something we do on top of our regular job, in addition to home and life responsibilities. So you have to imagine someone's already tired and overworked by the time they get to managing your manuscript. The very least you can do is lessen the burden by following the rules set out quite clearly in the author guidelines for editorial logistics. So in the next slides, I'll discuss some tips and tricks on how to identify what constitutes publishable work, as well as advice on data recording and writing that can help you go from hypothesis to DOI. But perhaps we should quickly review what doesn't constitute publishable work. This includes science, results, methods, or technology which do not fit in the scope of journal. And again, this is very easily found on journal websites and in the author guidelines. Does not significantly advance the field. We're not interested in looking to try to publish one-off experiments that are simply incremental to something you or somebody else has already done. Do not report statistics indicating reproducibility of the work. Because remember, when you publish work, the implication is that somebody else could take that paper and in their lab, repeat it. Any work that is not original is not suitable for publication. Things that are incremental to other published work have conclusions that are not supported by data or with inadequate controls, is not hypothesis driven, and more on that later on, or are poorly written in terms of English grammar, readability, and flow. In contrast, content which is suitable for publication includes science, results, methodologies, or technologies which fit well in the scope of the journal, are original, significantly advance the field, is reproducible, is thought-provoking and new, has conclusions supported by the data with the proper controls, and importantly, addresses a need in the current state of the art. So let's talk about something that might kind of be uncomfortable. What if your paper is rejected by another journal? It happens to all of us, and it could very well mean that your work was good, but just not suited for the scope of that other journal. So if you're considering resubmitting and submitting to an IFT scientific journal, be sure to follow the guidelines to be sure it fits within the scope and suitability for the journal. And do consider the comments from the prior review. In my experience, even the most critical reviews have ended up greatly improving my manuscripts. So it's well worth the effort to improve upon the work prior to resubmission. But absolutely, submit to one journal only, the right journal. Not only is it prohibited to submit your paper to multiple journals, it's also a really small world, and you're probably going to get caught. And finally, do pay attention to journal requirements, structure, and formatting. If you're doing a resubmission, chances are you'll have to edit to make sure that you're adhering to the requirements, structure, and formatting of the new journal. And please do take the time to update your introduction and cover letter appropriately. Moving on to how to select a research topic. The topic should, of course, be of significance, importance, and merit, and advance the field of food science. Chances are, if someone's funding you to do the work, or if you're just really interested in it, it probably already is. But you nevertheless need to establish the importance in the introduction. Your work should demonstrate advances to the field beyond treatment effects. In other words, comparisons that yield results akin to the effect of X on Y. You should also consider the likelihood of if your work will be read and cited by the journal's target audience. In the next couple slides, I'm going to reference some quotes from a publication in 2004 by the well-published George Whitesides, which I use in training my graduate students on technical writing. And I quote, "Your objective in research is to formulate and test hypotheses, to draw conclusions from these tests, and to teach these conclusions to others. Your objective is not to quote unquote collect data, end quote. So in other words, you want to work from hypothesis-driven research. You begin by raising a hypothesis, you then go on to answer this question. By conducting hypothesis-driven research, you can help to avoid this effective X on Y type papers. And be thinking throughout your research process of how you'll establish the introduction and motivation. Be well before you even get into the lab. During earlier experiments, you also may want to consider what reviewers might question you about. The more self-critical you are about your work before you even get in the lab, the better your resulting story and manuscript will be. Effectively establishing the motivation for why you've done the research, essentially answering the question, so what, cannot be overemphasized. By the end of your introduction, the reader must clearly and without question know the impact of your research. So this is going to be a little dorky, and I apologize in advance, but I've heard this described as painting a picture of a beautiful fantasy landscape, which is besieged by an evil monster. And as a researcher, you're presenting a magical sword, the only way to rid the landscape of an evil monster. Your work is the magical sword, which can overcome the fundamental hurdle, the monster, that prevents the realization of the potential, the impact of that fairy landscape, whether that is safe food for all, reducing food waste, improved nutrition, etc. Crafting the introduction in terms that clearly identifies your sword as the tool to overcome the monster is critical for establishing the motivation of your work. And an important reminder here, the introduction can be a common area for both intentional and inadvertent plagiarism. It's very important to check this section in particular to make sure you're writing and citing appropriately, but more on the plagiarism later on in the webinar. So when you set up your study, always be thinking with the intent to publish. And to do so, I think it's helpful to be self-critical. Think to yourself, what would the most ordinary reviewer say? If you were defending the research on trial, how would you anticipate what gaps in the data you'd need to fill in order to have a really solid case? It can help to leverage outlines in experimental planning. And remember, present the results in a logical manner. This is very often not the order in which experiments were performed. Large sections of data may not even end up in the publication, despite their importance in helping you reach your research goals. And it's of course important to stick to proper scientific method, even when, as indicated in this comic strip, there are external influences challenging you to see something in the data set that isn't there. But why is there often an instinct for researchers to force a result out of a data set? I'm not sure that's an easy question to answer, but one observation is this academic paradox. And this represents a real challenge with how most of us learned the scientific process. For about 22 years, we teach students in lab classes that there is a well-outlined experimental methodology, a known set of outcomes, and a defined right and wrong answer. The perception at the end of all this education is that the bulk of the process in terms of time spent is in conducting the research experiments. In practice, this is simply not the case. The reality is planning, figuring out what the right questions are to ask, formulating a hypothesis, establishing a state of the art is extremely time consuming. And we often have to return to the drawing board repeatedly. So in practice, the proportion of time in the scientific process that's spent in the lab doing experiments is much different from what we've taught students throughout their secondary education. This remains a challenge, but I think a critical part of graduate education. So let's move on to some essential practices and how best to write and report your data. We've alluded to this overall flow of the process, but let's outline it explicitly here. We begin with a hypothesis. Implicit in that hypothesis is that you're testing something new and unknown. Defining this well forms the basis of your introduction. You then do your best to design experiments and make measurements that allow you to test your hypothesis. This in text becomes the materials and methods section of your manuscript. Your results are then analyzed and the effects are described in the results. And finally, you place your results in the context of your hypothesis in what becomes the discussion section of your manuscript. But how do you start? Overcoming writer's block is a real challenge if you begin writing with a stack of data and a blank page. I am a big fan of outlines. And again, quoting Whitesides, a paper is not just an archival device for storing a completed research program. It is also a structure for planning your research in progress, end quote. And by the way, that structure very often shifts. Preliminary results often send us back to the drawing board, inspire us to add additional studies, reframe the order of the outline, etc. Which leads to another concept I'd like to introduce. That of considering your research progress and paper outline as a storyboard, similar to what's used in Hollywood to frame a timeline for a movie. But instead of scenes with characters, we have tables and figures that tell the story of the research project. These storyboarded figure outlines should be edited throughout the course of research. At the beginning, as shown here, you have a very loose sketch, an incomplete plan of the content and order in which you'll present the results. Further along, you've got a better defined outline. And you'll often decide that some content might be better suited for supplemental information, moved out of the manuscript altogether, forming the basis for another study, etc., as shown here. And slowly but surely, you start filling in the blanks with analyzed, formatted data. I'm a firm believer that if you treat your publication as a work in progress throughout the research project, this will be a much more efficient process than if you collect your data and only start to organize them when they're complete. Then, of course, you can expand on each figure, adding a descriptive figure legend, perhaps some bullet-pointed results. Only then, once you have a well-established figure outline, should you begin writing text. Improving the readability and grammar within a single sentence or a paragraph only helps if the overall structure of the manuscript is well organized to begin with to tell a meaningful story. Of course, we skipped something that's fairly important here. Before you can format a graph, you need data. And it's worth touching on the need for good record keeping, without which you cannot have a good paper. Your records should include detailed description of the methods that you've used. You want to include precise information about the instrumentation, the reagents, etc. that gives enough information that somebody trained in the technology would be able to repeat it based on what you've reported. And it'll also significantly help in your manuscript preparation. Of course, you want to record data, more on that later on. And any observations that can help make writing the results and discussion easier down the line will be very helpful at this stage. This also helps us to avoid repeating quote-unquote failures in the lab. And then finally, we want to record the date. This helps to align paper and electronic data sets. The format of lab notebooks is changing. We traditionally and still use pen on paper, often with carbon copies. But with a lot of our raw data now being electronic, and especially as we have an emerging importance of big data sets, many researchers are moving towards the use of electronic lab notebooks, which are more readily searchable and linked to files containing details about methods and large data sets. But regardless of the format, the major elements of a lab notebook are the same. You've got to include the date, the author, sufficient information to enable replication outside of the lab. It should be easy to read and very legible. In some cases, and some organizations require countersigning by another researcher in the group. And then finally, any errors should be corrected by marking a single line through the incorrect text. In terms of data collection, you should also consider proper statistical experimental design. You must consider the right number of replicates to be able to draw a statistically validated conclusion, the use of independent samples, and the design of experiments so that the results you present and the conclusions you draw account for variability not only within but between experimental runs. Complex systems, which we very routinely work with in food science research, often demand complex statistics beyond a simple ANOVA. Consulting with this trained statistician early on in a research program can help save a lot of time and frustration down the line. And this includes including proper controls, both negative or blank and positive. And positive controls can take many forms, depending on whatever the analysis is that you're doing, including spiked samples, external samples, and gold standards, which refer to a method or a sample considered by industry to be the current state of the art. We often use standard curves to take a raw value like an absorbance and translate that to a result like enzymatic activity. Proper use of standard curves is also important to ensure your publication draws conclusions based soundly on the experimental data. And remember, the standard curve is only useful for the range of values it contains. In this example, you cannot simply extend the linear relationship beyond the shaded blue area defined by the standard curve to reach the experimental data point. A major reason why this is not appropriate is that life's not always linear. Looking at this standard curve, you may expect the relationship to extend in a linear fashion, but in fact, it may plateau, as shown in the center and typical of enzyme kinetics and a lot of fluorescent dyes. Or it may hold a power relationship, as shown in the far right. Just as you need to use the correct calculations and statistics to come up with values you need to report, it's also critical to organize and present your data so that the reader can quickly interpret your results. Formatting will help with data presentation, and of course remember that while Excel and other programs will happily give you infinite insignificant figures, you must limit them to the true sensitivity of the least sensitive step in your experiment. Moving along. A well-crafted title is very, very important. Logistically speaking, your title helps an editor handle your manuscript to ensure it's assigned to an appropriate associate editor that knows the field well enough to assign it to relevant reviewers. Trust me, you want people that understand your science to be the ones reviewing your paper. It also helps readers find and subsequently cite your paper, because your paper is only relevant if anyone reads it. And that means it has to be searchable. Not only the keywords, but also the first few words have to be interesting enough to click the link. Importantly, you should consider a journal's readership when you craft your title. A title that might be appropriate for another journal, maybe a fundamental in the field of science journal, may not be suitable for an IFT scientific journal that's geared towards an audience of food scientists. To conclude this section, I've got a handful of slides of final tips and tricks. First, I tell my students, precise and concise. Write as few words, but the right ones as you possibly can to convey your point. You should provide references to support your key statements, and these references should be up to date from reputable journals and extend beyond your inner circle. The figure legends should be sufficiently detailed to be standalone, because you imagine after somebody clicks your title because they found the title interesting, they then scan your abstract. If that also looks good, they then scan your figure legends before deciding to completely dig into reading the article. So the figure legends are very important as well. Your abstract is best written after you've completed the rest of the manuscript, because very often we change the tone of the manuscript, we restructure our outline throughout the writing process. So writing the abstract at the very end means that it will best capture the overall point of the manuscript. Finally, you want to use appropriate software for citation management, illustrations, and chemistry schematics. Section headings can be very helpful in helping your organization. They should be specific, concise, and information-rich. They can help readers to scan through the text to find sections of interest. And then there's just a couple, I guess, I don't know, reviewer or editorial pet peeves that I just wanted to outline here. Firstly, datum is singular, data is plural. I.e., when you're referring to something parenthetically, means that is, means there's one thing you mean for it to be. E.g. means for example, so here's one of the many things that might work in this parentheses. E. coli is not hyphenated. If you want to irritate some food microbiologists, refer to your electronic coli with the hyphen in there. It's not a good idea. The word this should be followed by a noun. Use always the past tense. Complete all comparisons. And just a couple final writing tips. Your paper will be much more likely to be accepted if you start peer review before you submit. This includes getting feedback from lab mates, co-authors, and if English isn't your first language, it can help to leverage one of several reputable English language editing services prior to submitting your manuscript. That concludes my section of the webinar, and I'm happy to turn it over now to Mary Ellen.
Thank you, Julie. Now we're going to turn to a different issue in publication, the subject of ethics. There are four major topics I'm going to cover in these slides. First is authorship. Who should be included and listed as an author on a manuscript? Second, plagiarism. Has any of the material been copied from another source without proper crediting? Third, ethical care. Was permission obtained for research that involved either people or animals? And finally, misconduct. Was the research done and analyzed as it actually was reported? It's often difficult, particularly if you're a student or a junior faculty, to decide who should be listed on a publication. But the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors have come up with 4 good criteria, and authors that are listed should meet all 4 of these criteria. First, they should have made a significant contribution to the design of the research, or collected the data, or analyzed it, or interpreted, and they help with the writing or revision of the manuscript, and they approve the final version, and finally, they agree to be accountable. That is, they will stand by everything is accurate in the manuscript. So if someone does not meet all 4 of those criteria, they should not be listed. However, we do have a way to acknowledge those who have helped in different ways. So we have an acknowledgement section at the end of the manuscript. So someone who helped get funding, a supervisor such as your department head or dean, someone who gave you general editing or help with translation, or someone who helped enter data into the computer could be thanked in the acknowledgements. But always, please ask people if they mind being listed in the acknowledgements, because sometimes names get put on there and people don't realize that their name is going to appear in the manuscript at all. Don't acknowledge people anonymously, or just acknowledge people because you honor them or you want to flatter them. That it should only be people who contributed somehow in getting the research completed. Now, turning to plagiarism, this is a difficult subject, and it's one that the associate editors deal with quite a bit. Plagiarism is the use of any kind of material, whether they be ideas, actual words, data, or images, without enough credit being given to the people who actually created it. Sometimes people will quote an exact sentence because it was such a strong remark. If you're going to copy words exactly as they appeared in the original reference, please put quotation marks around that and say where the source of that information was. Don't just copy and paste text and then just put the author's name in parentheses. That's not acceptable. Also, don't take a sentence from a paper and just change a few words around and then try to pass it off as your own writing. That's also plagiarism. Another kind of plagiarism is called self-plagiarism, where you take paragraphs or sentences from papers you've already published. It's different if it's your own thesis. That's not considered a publication, but if you have a journal article and you have a second journal article you're writing that use the same methodology, you can't just copy all of the methods or other aspects and put that in the second manuscript. Please write it in a different way, and if you use standard methods, just cite those. You don't need to explain them all over again. If you modified a method, cite the original source of that method and then explain in your own words how you made those changes to the procedure. We do check every manuscript we receive for plagiarism using the program Authenticate. Almost every other journal I'm aware of uses a similar type of program. We began using Authenticate in 2008. So every manuscript is scanned, and then every editor reviews the reports. Sometimes things like the list of references may bump up the percent similarity, but we do check to make sure that it wasn't a problem with the program. In fact, people have copied information, not credited the authors properly. If we have repeated plagiarism problems or other types of ethical issues, those authors are marked with a red flag in Scholar 1, and that indicates that they have problems. They may be prohibited from publishing in the journal in the future. Next, in terms of ethical considerations, we do have a number of projects that are published in Journal of Food Science that involve either animal research or human research. If you studied living animals, please explain in your methods section that you got permission from your university's Committee for Protection of Animals and Research. If you're using data from people, then that could be samples of blood that you later analyzed, or doing sensory evaluation, or asking people to complete surveys, please add a statement that you had your institutional review board or other type of review committee approve the work with human subjects. So here's an example from a paper by Fang and co-workers in the recent February 2018 issue of Journal of Food Science. An experimental protocol was reviewed and approved by the Institutional Review Board. You don't need more than that, but putting it in there lets everyone know that you did follow the ethical considerations process. There are other types of research misconduct, and one of those is fabrication. Did you actually do the tests that you described? Did you make the data up? Or did you have some missing data, let's say in the standard curve, and you filled it in to get the results you wanted instead of doing the whole experiment over again? We also then have falsification, where you might have not used the same materials you said you used, or you changed the methods to get the results that you wanted to have to meet your hypothesis. And did you change or delete any data that you didn't agree with because it didn't agree with your expected results? So these are very serious concerns. And again, finding that you've had this problem could really affect your career. We also want to make sure that your data is presented so it shows differences correctly. Sometimes if you manipulate the scale, you can make it look like there were large differences than there really were. Everyone makes mistakes, and if you make an honest mistake, we won't consider it research misconduct, but the effect of having to retract your work might be very damaging to your professional reputation. Among the consequences of research misconduct are losing your reputation. You might be fired because your institution's reputation is affected. You may have copyright fines applied because you used material that was not permitted without copyright clearance. You and your co-authors could be banned from submitting papers to the journal again. And then publication of papers that are then retracted are followed on websites. And so it's very well known when somebody has a paper retracted because of research misconduct, that will follow you literally through your whole career. The journals don't want to have this happen either. It hurts our reputation, and it creates a lot of additional work for our staff, which adds to the cost of publishing the journal. Now we're going to move on to a different topic. What happens in the peer review process? So you've got your manuscript ready, you've pushed the submit button, what happens next? In the peer review process, we have experts review a manuscript for several criteria. The scope, which means is the article appropriate for this particular journal? The novelty, whether the material is different enough from earlier publications to make it of interest to readers. Validity, whether the study is well designed and well executed. And of course, the data. Are they reported, analyzed, and interpreted correctly, or were there misunderstandings about what the data actually meant? Clarity is also a criteria. Are the ideas expressed clearly, concisely, and logically? And then we've just talked about compliance with ethical issues, but also journal requirements need to be met. And finally, the topic of advancement is important. Does the material in this paper actually contribute a lot to the field, or is it just a repeat of previously published work? Most scientists feel that peer review is important. 84% reported that without peer review, there would be no control and people would just publish anything. And that they felt that peer review also meant better research, that having other scientists evaluate your work helped you to do better research. And it's also important to have good reviews. If you have an expert reviewer who writes thorough, supportive, constructive reviews, that will help quite a bit with the publishing process. We want to have good quality reviewers, and we also want them to submit their reviews quickly. These are the top 2 factors that lead to a good publishing experience and make people want to publish in a journal. And the publishers themselves are also important to making sure that the peer review process is quick, accurate, and a pleasant experience for everyone involved. So here's a little cartoon where the scientist has conducted her work, writes it up, sends it to the editor of a journal. They decide to send it for peer review or reject it right away. And then it'll go to be reviewed some more. It may go back. There may be several versions that have to be reviewed, or it may be reviewed and rejected. And so the author has to rewrite the journal article for a different journal and get it in the right format. But hopefully will be a smooth process, and after some minimal edits, they'll be successful and be able to be accepted for the journal that the paper was first submitted to. But even the most established scientists in food science have experienced rejection. It's something we all go through, so please don't feel that you're being singled out, because I'm sure almost everybody on our editorial board has been through the same thing. There are criticisms of how papers are peer reviewed, and it can seem like a lengthy process. In 2017, the editorial boards of the IFT journals decided that we should move to a 3-week review period from a 4-week period. So we feel within 3 weeks, we should be able to get good reviews, and that will speed up the process considerably. Another complaint that's heard about the peer review process is that there may be bias among the reviewers and editors, and we really do try to screen for that. And occasionally there are mistakes. Sometimes papers get rejected or accepted when the work had errors in it. So there are both those happen, but we strive as an editorial board to make sure that that doesn't happen. Now this is a busy chart, but it is a long process. So first you prepare your manuscript, submit it for your Scholar 1. Our staff check the plagiarism. They check the metadata and the formatting. And if there are problems, they go back to the author. Once they're okay by the staff, they are submitted to the scientific editor, who may decide to reject the paper at that point. If it's okay, then the scientific editor will assign the manuscript to an associate editor who's an expert in that particular topic of food science. The associate editor will look at the paper, do a quick review, and invite at least 2 and preferably 3 peer reviewers to review the paper. Once we have the reviews back, the associate editor will consider the reviews, add some more comments, and then make a recommendation to the scientific editor. At that point, the paper might be accepted or rejected, or the authors will be asked to provide another revision. That we hope that this will be done quickly to speed up the process of publication. So the more quickly you can make your changes and get them back, the more quickly we can get your paper published. Once the paper has been accepted, the administrators check the files, export them, and send them to Wiley, our publisher, and assign each article to an issue of the journal. The logistics of setting the article up for publication typically takes about 2 or 3 weeks. If you're not a member of IFT, you will be charged page charges. That's the benefit of IFT membership for authors, is that you do not have to pay page charges for our journals. And then finally, you'll get a galley to proof and correct. And then once you've made those changes or said it's fine, it'll be published in early view as early as possible with a DOI, and then you're published. We ask of our reviewers to provide us with the best possible review. It should be critical, unbiased, sufficiently detailed, polite or courteous, and on time. We do ask for you to suggest some reviewers, and the associate editors may or may not include those reviewers in the list of people who look at your paper. The editors will check, but they might look at your list of references and say, oh, this author was cited quite a bit. Let's ask that person to review this paper. But please don't leave out references that are important to justifying your work simply because you do not want those authors to review your paper. You can ask to have certain scientists excluded from looking at or reviewing at your paper, but keep in mind that the editors don't have to follow your wishes. You can, of course, suggest scientists who you feel can really do a good job assessing your research, but don't recommend people with whom you've collaborated, people who were your professors or mentors or your former students, or friends who are not experts in that particular field. As I said, we try to get at least 3 reviewers, but sometimes we get 2 reviews in and they totally disagree. In that case, we'll try to make sure that we get 3 or even 4 reviews to make sure that we have a consensus on the quality of the paper. Our next topic is how to promote your article once you're published. This is the exciting part. There are mutual benefits for you and the journals by promoting your article. The more people who read your paper, the more times you'll be cited. Then your paper will have a higher impact factor. You and the journal will have more prestige. That will cause more people to submit papers to the journal, and then we get more readers. So it's just a cycle where everyone wins. So how do you go about promoting your article in the days of all these media sites? Well, there are many ways you can publicize your work. Before submission, you can choose your keywords that are going to be interesting to people and are broad enough that search engines will pick up those words and recommend them to people doing searches. Also, make sure that your abstract is one that is interesting and may get people to want to read the entire paper. Also include diagrams, flowcharts, or photographs that are unique and other authors might want to refer to and then cite in their papers. And also, please add your ORCID author identifier so that people can follow you and check your other papers. After your paper has been accepted, please share your digital object identifier and a brief explanation of the paper and its importance on social media and research sharing networks. So LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Google Scholar, ResearchGate, Mendeley, academia.edu. There are many sites where you can share information about your work. They don't need to have access to the whole paper, but just to let people know that your research has been accepted, and so people who are interested in the topic can search it out. When the paper is actually published, contact your media communications office in your institution, and they can release a press release or otherwise publicize the news that your paper has been published, and that will be of interest to your professional colleagues and also interested stakeholders in your community. Also, put information about the new paper on your own website. You could have a link to the abstract or put a note for people to contact you if they'd like a copy of the PDF. There are many options available, but by promoting your paper, you're going to get more people citing it, and that results in benefits for both you and journal. So in summary, welcome to the world of scientific publication. We're looking forward to receiving your manuscripts.
Hello again. This is Alan Fogading, Editor-in-Chief of IFT Scientific Journals. I would like to thank Julian and Mary Ellen for providing 2 excellent talks on publishing. And while I cannot guarantee it, I will say that if you follow their guidance, you will have a very high probability of having your manuscript accepted and published in our journals. Thank you for listening to our webinar, and we look forward to receiving your manuscripts.